Hello, I'm Terrence McNally, and welcome to another newly recorded episode of Free Forum, a world that just might work. And I'll be speaking today with David Faris about the ideas in his book, It's Time to Fight Dirty: How Democrats Can Build a Lasting Majority in American Politics. As many of you know, after a 3-year hiatus with the election of Donald Trump, I couldn't resist exploring the path forward in new interviews, and this is the 28th such one of those. Paul Hawken on climate change, Naomi Klein on her book No Is Not Enough, David K. Johnston on the daily dirty work of the Trump administration, and so on. The show streams weekly on the Progressive Voices Network on TuneIn. Podcasts are available anytime, anywhere on iTunes, Podomatic.com, and at my site, terrencemcnally.net. And as I do every show, let me offer you a few websites for information on how to participate in resistance to the Trump agenda and work toward the healthy and just future we all need. There's indivisibleguide.com. That's one word, indivisibleguide.com. That's probably the largest, most organized national area of resistance with, I think, local groups in about 5,000 communities. OurRevolution.com, that's Our Revolution, O-U-R, revolution, one word.com, that's a group that grew out of the Bernie Sanders campaign. MoveOn.org and CourageCampaign.org. Those are two organizations, Move On National, Courage Campaign in California, that for the most part, throughout most of their history, have focused on digital campaigning and digital work, but they have, since the Trump election, are coordinating their work much more closely with grassroots folks on the ground. And two sort of specialized, one, 5 Calls, that's the number 5 and the word calls, 5calls.org, which tells you the most relevant and timely phone calls you might want to make to reach your representatives. And Town Hall Project, one word, townhallproject.com, which tells you when town halls will take place near you where you can go and actually interact with your representatives in person. Now to today's guest. As I said, actually, in introducing my recent interview with Nancy MacLean regarding her book, Democracy in Chains, the right and the GOP know that if politics and elections are played fair and square, they lose. So they've turned to strategies and tactics that allow them to gain and hold power despite the lack of popular support for them or their policies. Gerrymandering, voter suppression, the refusal to even act on Obama's nomination of Merrick Garland to the Supreme Court. The list goes on. Well, today's guest says it's time for the Democrats to fight fire with fire, time to fight dirty. David Faris is an associate professor of political science at Roosevelt University and a frequent contributor to Informed Consent and The Week. He's the author of Dissent and Revolution in a Digital Age, Social Media Blogging and Activism in Egypt, and his newest, It's Time to Fight Dirty: How Democrats Can Build a Lasting Majority in American Politics. You can learn more about David's work at blogs.roosevelt.edu/dfaris, F-A-R-I-S. I'll repeat that, blogs.roosevelt.edu/dfaris. Faris, D-F-A-R-I-S. Welcome, David Faris, to Free Forum, a world that just might work.
Hey, pleasure to be here, Terrence.
Okay, and let me tell listeners we're recording this conversation Wednesday, June 6th, 2018. So I like people to get a feel for the people behind the work and the ideas that we talk about. So could you, before we get into today's subject, tell us a bit about how you see your path to the work that you do today? And I don't just mean the last year or two, how you maybe turned to political science, early childhood or youth experiences, mentors, turning points, that sort of thing, so we kind of get the narrative that takes us to today.
Sure, yeah. So, I grew up in a very political household. We were the kind of people who put political lawn signs out for the local elections and things like that. And so I've been, really into national politics since I was a teenager in high school, and I edited the school newspaper there. And I'm kind of a political science lifer. I majored in political science as an undergrad, and kind of made a decision late in my career there that I would go to grad school for a PhD in politics. Interestingly, I got kind of bit with the Middle East bug when I was in college. I took a couple of great classes, and I decided to focus on the Middle East for my scholarship. and up until recently, I focused on Egypt and American foreign policy in the Middle East. And I wrote this book about Egypt in 2013 about the uprising there in 2011. And what happened over the last few years, I guess, is it became just harder and harder to get to the Middle East. Became a little bit dicey for me personally because I've been a critic of this new regime that took power in 2013, and some folks in the State Department kind of recommended that I think twice about traveling there. And so, that was a big change for me. I kind of decided that I was no longer willing to take the sort of physical risks of traveling to the region, and increasingly just kind of turned to thinking about the predicament of the United States during the Obama era, and then heading into the 2016 elections. I started writing for The Week, mostly about the U.S., and it kind of just crystallized the sort of the choice that was in front of me about my own career. But America is right here. So I thought, why don't I just study what's happening here? Kind of turn some of the insights that I have from comparative politics, take a real hard look at the American political system and see what we might do about some of the problems that we're seeing. Yeah.
Let me cut in for a second just to ask a couple of things. One, informed consent, when I looked at it, seems to mostly be about international affairs and the Middle East, and there may be some people who aren't aware of informed consent or The Week. Could you tell people what those publications are?
Sure. So it's Informed Comment, and it's the blog of a Middle East scholar named Juan Cole.
Sure.
Who I've had a number of interactions with over the years, and he sort of let me start writing for his site, which is pretty popular in its kind of corner of the universe for sort of like left-wing looks at Middle East policy. And so, I started writing for him in, I think it was 2014. That's been a lot of fun. And just interestingly, during the 2016 election, I started writing for him about the United States. So he kind of created this section about the U.S., sort of, I guess, to broaden the scope of the website a bit. And I wrote a series of articles about Donald Trump and the election and the stakes of that election, sort of while I was sort of ramping up my work for The Week too. So is that
informedcomment.com?
Mm-hmm. Right? Informed. It's you can go to juancole.com.
Right, Juan Cole or Informed Comment, and then The Week, which I've read for years, but is not necessarily something everyone knows about. Tell us a little bit about that one.
I mean, I think if you know The Week, you probably know the print version, which arrives with these really wonderful cartoons on the cover about the sort of the political events of the week in the U.S. and the world. And they have really stepped up their digital presence in the last few years. So they have a number of writers from the left and the right. That's what's really interesting about The Week is that it's kind of like a heterodox site. It's not like The Nation. It's not like the National Review. They really do have writers from across the spectrum. And I had a friend from my graduate school days at the University of Pennsylvania named Damon Linker, who put me in touch with the editor and started submitting things to them. And it's just kind of worked out for all of us. I really enjoy the sort of the freedom that they give me to write at length. I often turn in articles that are 1,500 and 1,600 words long, which you can't do in major newspapers.
Right.
Yeah. So
and
it's
you're,
great.
as I looked, you're up there almost every week, right?
Yeah, but pretty much every week. I'm doing a stretch now where I'm writing a piece every day for them for a couple of weeks, and but mostly it's been one or two per week. Sometimes I write about breaking news. I'll file an overnight piece about election results, things like that, and some of the other pieces are kind of pre-planned. But yeah, it's been really great. They have a great sort of social media presence. I feel like the articles are reaching a broader audience. Sometimes they get linked on Real Clear Politics, which is a right-leaning site. So I get some interesting emails sometimes from people.
That's right, and so that
who disagree with me, but it's cool that it's reaching people. That it's not just a sort of ideological cul-de-sac. I really like that about The Week.
And that one is The Week, TheWeek, theweek.com. Right.
Yeah.
And one other thing I wanted to mention is one of my favorite interviews over the last several years was one I did with Wael Ghanim on his book Revolution 2.0. and another that I did with the production filmmakers of The Square, both of which covered the events in Egypt, which at the time I did both of those, things were sort of on a positive rise. And could you tell us just a little bit, again, before we move into this book, what the current situation in Egypt is?
Sure, yeah. So, my work on that started in 2006. I went to Egypt and I started interviewing these digital activists who were using the internet and using blogs and, eventually Twitter to challenge the government. And so in 2011, many of those activists, people that I had been talking to for years, were some of the most important actors in the uprising in Egypt. And they deposed Hosni Mubarak, the longtime dictator of Egypt. And for a time, Egypt had elections, relatively free and fair elections that brought the Muslim Brotherhood to power, which is kind of what everybody expected because they were the most organized force in Egypt at the time. And over the course of the sort of one-year presidency of Mohamed Morsi from the Brotherhood, people were dissatisfied with their leadership, and in particular, they threatened some of the prerogatives of the military, which you just can't do in Egypt. So in the summer of 2013, military leaders orchestrated a coup against Morsi, who was arrested. His government was replaced with a military dictatorship that is still in place today. So the president of Egypt, Sisi, is really even more tyrannical than Mubarak was, and they've learned some of the lessons of how Mubarak was deposed. They've really cracked down on the activists, not just on the Brotherhood people that they deposed, but they've really cracked down on the whole sort of activist sector, including people on the left. A lot of people that were responsible for the uprising are in prison. And so it's really depressing. I'll be totally honest with you. A lot of the people that I studied with in Egypt were here in the U.S. when the uprising happened, and we were just inspired by the events that took place. I mean, you've seen The Square. It's an uplifting film in a lot of ways, because these folks were outgunned and outnumbered, and somehow they outsmarted the regime, only to see it sort of reshuffle and recapitulate itself as an even more sort of dark and sinister force. And so Egypt today is one of the most authoritarian countries in the world.
Yeah, and for folks who haven't seen The Square, I highly recommend it. One of the two of the aspects of it that I particularly find powerful is one, by using the smallest cameras that became available only about that time, the documentary takes place in the middle of demonstrations. It gives you a feeling almost that you are in the square. And the second thing is that they showed a cut of that film before, while Morsi was in power, and they had a finished cut that kind of ended with his election, and then events moved so quickly that they went back in and shot more and re-edited it, and it now includes the overthrow of Morsi, and kind of you're left with, I think you're left with the fear of what might happen, and of course we now know, as you just said, what has happened. But the film is an amazing experience of as I say, almost being, you feel as if at times you are in the demonstrations.
Yeah, I mean, you really are. I mean, the movie puts you in the thick of the action, and it's an incredible film. I went back to Egypt in the summer of 2011, sort of after the uprising, to interview some more people for the book that I was writing. And there was a lot of optimism. I mean, there was a lot of chaos too. I mean, it's very difficult to create a democracy from the ground up, particularly in a very poor country with a sort of long tradition of authoritarianism. And unfortunately, it just hasn't worked out the way that the activists wanted it to, and the way that many, I think, Egypt watchers wanted it to. And I had some dreams of studying, the emergence of a new democracy in Egypt.
Sure.
And it just didn't happen.
Yeah. No, I think for many of us, it is a harsh lesson in the limits of certain kinds of activism against certain kinds of authoritarians, and really makes you say, so what will work? Let's move now to the work you're doing. The book that we're primarily going to talk about is "It's Time to Fight Dirty: How Democrats Can Build a Lasting Majority in American Politics." You've said two things that I'm going to jump from. One is that you're a lifelong sort of political junkie, and two, that you began to focus more on the U.S. over the last few years. How did this book happen?
Well, the book was the product of my despair. I woke up on the day after the 2016 election and was just despondent. I couldn't believe, first of all, that this horrendous human being had won the presidency, but it also just was incredibly frustrating to me that after all of the sort of obstruction and parliamentary maneuvers and voter suppression that took place during the Obama administration, that these guys weren't punished by the voters for what they did. In fact, they were rewarded for it. And when I thought forward to the next few elections, assuming that there ever would be free and fair elections in the United States again, it looked grim. Republicans have this built-in advantage in the House of Representatives, due not just to gerrymandering, but also due to the way that we all kind of increasingly live apart. Democrats in the big cities and Republicans in the rural areas. The Senate map looked terrible for 2018. We're defending 25 seats against 8 for the Republicans, and a lot of those seats were in states that Trump won by very large margins. And it hadn't yet, the week after the election hadn't yet become clear how inept the Trump administration really would be politically and policy-wise. And so what I really thought about at that time, a very dark time, was what could we do in the future? Not just to
let me
get back into power, but what could we do with that power once we're in office again to make the electoral playing field fair?
Yeah, one of the things I felt, and I'm sure I was one of millions, and you may have been another of those millions, after watching the Republicans amass not just the presidency in 2016, but the enormous power they hold in the states based on their focus in 2010 and after 2010 in winning in state legislatures so that they would be the ones to draw districts henceforth. So to see also them win the presidency for the second time in the century with a minority of the popular vote, one of my feelings was, if this were any other business, I'd hire another agency than the Democrats. Do you know what I mean? If I could hire a new ad agency or a new accounting firm, a new legal team, I would do it. And yet here we are, where that really isn't possible. I mean, there's various tinkering around the edges one can do with third parties, but in this country, that's really not possible. Similar feeling on your part?
Yeah, I mean, I was frustrated with the party. I think everybody was frustrated with the party. And I think that the Democrats made a lot of mistakes in 2016. I think Hillary Clinton made a lot of mistakes in terms of her campaign strategy. Congressional and Senate Democrats, they didn't offer a coherent vision of what it is exactly that they wanted to do. And they really allowed themselves to get outflanked on some of these economic issues that should have been their bread and butter, but they for a long time had gotten away from really voting and working on behalf of working people in the U.S. And it allowed Donald Trump, this oligarch, to claim the mantle of populism.
Yeah.
And it's all a lie. But Democrats should have been able to see that coming.
I also point to, as you do as well, that 2010 taking their eye off the ball was the start of electing Trump. And you actually go back further, but to me, it's that moment when they having won in 2008, they didn't focus on winning states in 2010, knowing that is one of the, as in every decade, we redo the districts, and only every other decade is that not a presidential election year. In other words, in 2020 it will be, in 2040 it will,
Yeah.
And so that was such a crucial thing, and they took their eye completely off the ball So I go back there. You go back further when you start unraveling these things to Newt Gingrich and his behavior in Congress. So let's say, okay, we got the Democrats are frustrating. They've allowed this to happen. There is hope among some on the left, certainly, that if the party were to push more of a Bernie Sanders platform, single payer, job guarantees, maybe basic income, et cetera, that the party could go back into those places. And both of us are well aware we're not talking about that they won a popular election. They won an electoral college election. But in most states, they have won popular elections. But perhaps if they had the right policies and the right folks, that they could begin to compete and reverse these fortunes. How do you feel about that?
I'm of two minds on this. Obviously, I think the policies are important, and I particularly think the way that we frame the policies is very important. I think Democrats have a very difficult time talking about their policies because the policy fixes are complicated. And one of the things that Donald Trump was really quite good at was just saying what he wanted to do, and letting other people figure out the policy details. Now, we know now that he doesn't have anybody to figure out those details, and we do. But we need to be able to talk about outcomes. How do we want American society to look? What would a more fair economic system look like? And I think getting those policies together, finding ways to communicate them to the voters, is a really critically important task for the Democratic Party. But the gimmick of the book is that that's not enough, because of some of the things that Republicans have done on purpose, but also some of the residue of the constitutional framework. Democrats keep losing elections that we actually won. And it's not just the Electoral College, it's not just 2000 and 2016. I'm thinking of years like 2012, where Democrats won more votes for the House of Representatives and yet still saw Republicans claim a large majority in the House from 2013 to 2015. And just imagine, what our history might look like, recent history, if Democrats had won the House in 2012, if Barack Obama had at least 2 more years to make actual policy, to fix flaws in the ACA, to follow up on some of these financial reforms, to pass laws like real immigration reform, so that issue might not have even been on the table in 2016, had our electoral system just delivered to us the results that we actually voted for. And it's one of the most frustrating things about American politics is the way that these gimmicks create an artificial Republican majority out of what is really a minority. And so what I think Democrats have to do is not just get smart about policy. What they have to understand is that they're starting off every national election at a disadvantage. It's like you're beginning a football game down 2 touchdowns. Sometimes you'll win anyway, but often you won't, right? Like, I think that the way the electoral system is set up in the U.S., Democrats will lose more often than they will win because of gerrymandering, because of partisan sorting, because of the equal representation clause for the Senate, which is a real problem that we need to think of creative workarounds for. And so, when I was lying awake after the election at night, gripped by insomnia and fear and despair,
yeah.
I thought, I've been studying comparative politics for a long time. There are different ways that we could run these things, and there are fixes that don't require a constitutional amendment that would deliver us from some of this agony. All we need to do is kind of come up with those solutions, get our representatives to care about them, and then pass them. Just acts of Congress signed by the president, and some of these things could sort of disappear from the face of the earth forever. So that, again, policy is important, but also, institutions are important. The rules of the game are important. And that's one of the things that the Democrats really have to get smart about.
That's right.
And a little bit more ruthless.
As you were answering that question, I wrote down 3 things. And I think what we're talking about here is the 4th. There's policy, there's message, there's money. All 3 of those are very important in winning elections. But the 4th, which is both about winning elections and being able to enact the policies and deliver on your message, has to do with what you call procedure, which to me is such a wonky term that it hardly seems, you can rally folks at the barricades over procedure, but we will get into what you mean by that. But before we do, I wanted you to talk about one of the things that I think is the sort of one of the deep underlying foundations of this, and it does go back to the Constitution. and it's the disproportionate power of rural versus urban citizens, not just in the federal system, but in the legislative bodies of most states. It has grown from the very inception of this nation, and I believe that soon 40% of the population will live in cities, and I think they will only have 30% of the representation that the rural areas will. I mean, are those? I'm not sure if my numbers are exactly correct, but talk just a little bit about the embedded advantage that rural voters have, as I say, not just in the federal, but in the states as well.
Sure. Yeah, this is the residue of compromises made at the Constitutional Convention to get the states to agree to the framework. They gave each state the same 2 representatives in the U.S. Senate, regardless of their population. And in 1787, it didn't seem like that big of a deal because the disparities were not as wide as they are today. But the way that sort of American history has unfolded, what we've seen is the proliferation of very small states, and many of them Republican, but not all. There's Delaware and there's Vermont too. There's Rhode Island, but there's a plethora of states in the U.S. West, Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, that were deliberately brought into the Union by Republicans in the 19th century to improve their numbers in the Senate. It was actually I don't think people know this. But that was a deliberate plan to increase their representation. So what we've ended up with is that the 38 million people of California have the same 2 senators as the 700,000 people of Wyoming. And that is an enormous structural advantage for people who live in small states. And because small states are largely rural, it gives an embedded structural advantage to both America's rural citizens and to people from small states, right? And there's nothing wrong with those people, right? It's not like they're doing it on purpose. But the constitutional framework gives them more power than they really should have in our system. What we have right now is a situation where we have 30 or 31 Republican-leaning states, 19 or 20 Democratic-leaning states. In sheer numbers, we outnumber Republicans, but we're going to have a very hard time winning the Senate or keeping it for more than a couple of years because of the way the Senate is structured, and that's a very difficult problem to get around.
Okay, so your book focuses on federal, but that same situation seems to me to happen in almost every state. Every state that I've examined, the same thing, a disproportionate amount of power held by the rural districts within each state.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it has to do with because most states use the same procedure for drawing their state legislative districts that we use to draw for the House of Representatives. In other words, they're drawn by partisan leaders, state legislatures in conjunction with the state's governor, and particularly after 2010, Republicans in state after state controlled both of these institutions. They controlled the state legislature and then they controlled the governorship. And they use that power to draw the districts in such a way to advantage their base in the sort of rural areas and the ex-urban areas, and to disadvantage Democrats in these big urban areas, because there's obviously ways to draw the districts so that you trap Democrats in a small number of districts in like Philadelphia or Raleigh, Durham, and then the rest of the state is dominated by Republicans. And so, yeah, it's the same problem. It's the same problem at the state level that it is at the national level. And it's a problem that is made possible by the framework that we use to compose these legislatures. And it doesn't have to be like that. So there's nothing in the Constitution that says that we have to run 435 separate elections for the House of Representatives. There's nothing in the Constitution that says states have to elect their legislatures in this fashion either. So, these are there are fixes for these problems. We need to start talking about them.
Okay, so one of the things I'm going to read a quote of yours. The Constitution is a shockingly short document, and it turns out that it's extremely vague on some key procedures that we rely on to help government function at a basic level. We don't talk much, it seems to me, about the ambiguity of the Constitution, about sort of the loopholes in the Constitution. We don't talk much about what is actually based on the Constitution and what is just based on the way things have unfolded. And that really, in some sense, it seems to me, is the foundation from which the rest of your book generates. So let me just tell people, by the way, this is Free Forum, a world that just might work. I'm Terrence McNally. I'm speaking with David Faris, Faris, about the ideas in his new book, It's Time to Fight Dirty, How Democrats Can Build a Lasting Majority in American Politics. And I think lasting majority is the key point there, that you may win an election here and there, but to really have a lasting influence, there's got to be some changes. And you can learn more about David's work, and he is writing a lot. He puts new stuff up more than once a week, and so you'll find his work at blogs.roosevelt.edu/dfaris, DFARIS, blogs.roosevelt.edu/dfaris. So, as I said just before that, it's the gaps sort of in the Constitution that really form the foundation of your approach. Talk about that.
Sure. I mean, the Constitution, you could read it on your lunch break. It was an ingenious document in many ways, very inventive document. In a lot of ways it served us well, but in a lot of ways it hasn't. And one of the ways that it does not serve us well is its sort of lack of specificity about some of the key procedures that make our politics work. You see one of those ambiguities on display right now in our politics when President Trump is talking about pardoning himself. The Constitution does grant the president this sort of wide-ranging power to pardon people for federal crimes. And he's right that it doesn't say he can't pardon himself. Right? There's nothing in there that says the president can't pardon himself. And so that's a big, important example of the way that the Constitution set up these procedures and set up these powers for each branch of government, but then didn't really talk much about how to resolve disagreements between the branches. It often didn't spell out the precise obligations of the actors in our political system. And that is a loophole, or set of loopholes, that Republicans have been very successfully exploiting over the last 20 years. So, for example, when Republicans decided not to hold hearings for Merrick Garland in 2016, they correctly pointed out that the Constitution's advice and consent clause doesn't actually obligate the Senate to do anything. Right? It just says the president needs the Senate's advice and consent for certain kinds of nominees. It doesn't say, what's the time frame. It doesn't say anything about hearings. Right? The word hearings is not in the Constitution. Doesn't say anything about what happens if the Senate simply won't do it. And so technically, Republicans were right. And it's an example of the GOP kind of pushing the boundaries of legality by looking at the Constitution, asking themselves, what is legally permissible here? Like, how far can we push this without running into a constitutional roadblock?
Right. And now let me ask you, because I talked about it a bit before Obama left office, but were there any cards, we'll take this example, were the Democrats to play the same way that the Republicans were there things they could have done to get Merrick Garland onto the Supreme Court before Obama left office?
I mean, I don't think so. I mean, I think that Obama could have fought a little bit harder for this. There's a couple of the pretty hardball things I think he could have done had he wanted to. One of them would have been to instruct Garland to take a seat on the court and say, the Senate has abdicated its constitutional responsibility, and then that would have ended up in court somehow or some way. And I think that the Supreme Court ultimately would have ruled on it. Not super confident that Obama would have prevailed, but I think it would have been a signal to the left that he wasn't, we weren't just willing to sit and watch as Republicans stole the swing seat on the Supreme Court. There was also a lot of talk, I don't know if you remember this, right before Trump took office, that Democrats could use the moment of changeover in the Senate.
That's right.
To approve Garland. So, like when the senators who had been up for election in 2016 before they were sworn in, the Senate would have been smaller, right? Would have been missing 33 people, and Democrats would have held a majority for like the few minutes after those people left and before the new people were dabbled in. I'm not a precise enough constitutional expert to tell you whether that would have worked, but I was disappointed that nobody really, that none of our leaders really talked about some of these procedures because there's procedural hardball being used against you.
That's right.
And then Democrats were just kind of like, well, yeah, there's nothing we can do,
Okay.
Here's the swing seat.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And here's a swing seat in the only, well, not the only, but in the offices in America that serve for life. You know,
Right.
that if you want to compound the impact, you have to point to that. Um, Before we get again into some more of the specific suggestions you make, here's another quote from you. For the government to work, cooperation between parties is needed. This is what the Constitution is based on, you say. But when that cooperation is withdrawn, it creates chaos. Now, why would the framers make this assumption? And I'm going to ask you to sort of to think about this. Did they consider the possibility of saddling the future with such a compromise structure that was likely to fail if cooperation were ever to weaken or disappear? And that sounds like they were organizing a country on a best case scenario. You
Well,
know,
yeah,
which, by the way,
definitely.
is how we got into the Iraq War and how we get into the subprime financial crisis. When leaders, act on best case scenarios, the outcome is seldom good. So, did they actually think that, or did they believe that future generations would keep updating the Constitution? What do you think was going on there? Because it seems like such a fatal flaw.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that the framers of the Constitution had an assumption that the amendment process that they put into place would be easier to use than it has been in practice. And the sort of early history of the United States sort of helped confirm their initial instincts, right? We passed 10 amendments to the Constitution almost right away.
Oh, you're right. Yeah.
But over time, the roadblocks have become higher. As we've added more states, the sort of three-quarters of the states procedure to amend the Constitution has become much more difficult to achieve, particularly in a partisan environment. So that at this point, anything that would be perceived by either party to have a partisan impact is simply not going to make it through the amendment process. I also don't think that many of the framers of the Constitution really believed that the structure that they put into place was forever. I think that they believed that the framework would and should be updated based on unfolding events. So this whole judicial doctrine of originalism, I think that the framers of the Constitution would find it bananas.
Yeah.
That we have a sort of a set of judicial thinkers in this country who believe that we can't change the Constitution, we can't update our institutions unless we amend it.
Right.
And so, yeah, I mean, it was a huge oversight.
It becomes almost.
Also, it was a different universe. You know, I mean, we didn't have political parties in 1787 in the way that we do today.
Right. I mean, it becomes almost like religious dogma. In the way that it, or church, church dogma in the way that it cannot be touched, rather than an evolving thing that responds to change. Let's talk about some of your recommendations. And I'm going to ask you first, use two filters. What would have the most impact that you think could actually happen? In other words, each of your recommendations is going to vary on impact and on likelihood of being able to be achieved. What do you think is the number one in your thing that both would have big impact and could be achieved?
Sure. So let me start with the kind of lowest hanging fruit here. And by lowest hanging fruit, I mean things that I think that we could achieve within the first 6 months of the next Democratic administration pretty easily if we set our minds to it. The first of those things is statehood for Washington, D.C. and Puerto Rico. These are two territories that are full of birthright American citizens and yet have no voting representation in Congress. For Washington, D.C., that's because of very archaic reasons related to the construction of the Capitol and provisions in the Constitution about the Capitol itself. The framers did not envision 700,000 people living in the Capital District, and I think that they would be appalled that 230 years later, those 700,000 people still don't have representation in Congress, and it wreaks all kinds of havoc on D.C., from the city budget to what happens to people that end up in the penal system, and it's indefensible. It's an indefensible arrangement, and it's just as indefensible in Puerto Rico.
And the number you said, by the way,
over the last year, what happens when people in Washington, D.C. don't have to answer to anyone for the things that they do.
Yeah. So, and I think you said Washington, D.C., 700,000, so basically the same as, North Dakota, right?
Right. Yeah, it's very similar to the other kind of very small states in the U.S.
Right.
I think it'd be roughly equivalent to Vermont and Wyoming.
Okay.
Depending on, we'll find out exactly how many people are in D.C. at the next census.
That's right. And then Puerto Rico, 3 million, right?
Right. Yeah. There's many more people in Puerto Rico.
Yeah.
So
And how
that would be, just a tabletop math here, it'd probably be 4 seats in the House or 5 seats in the House,
right?
and then 2 senators from each of these territories.
And they would likely be Democrats. You say that's the lowest hanging fruit. What has to happen for that to happen?
Well, the statehood process in the Constitution is very simple. It's an act of Congress and signed by the president, and that's it. So, but I think in our sort of modern conception of democracy, we obviously want the consent of the people involved in this process in D.C. and Puerto Rico. So D.C. held a statehood referendum in 2016 and passed overwhelmingly. I believe it was 86-14. And then last year, Puerto Rico held a referendum about their political status. And statehood was the overwhelming choice of the people who showed up, although there was a boycott of that referendum by folks who want to see Puerto Rico be an independent state. So personally, I think Puerto Rico needs to hold a new election, a new referendum, use ranked choice voting to produce a majority for something, give the statehood proponents, give the status quo proponents, and then give the independence proponents a chance to win. And then Congress should act on the preferences of the people of Puerto Rico. I strongly suspect that the neglect and suffering that's happened in Puerto Rico over the past year has boosted the statehood movement.
Right. In other words,
I think people see what the consequences are of not being a state.
Right. The status quo, you can see what that would do, and then you could say, what would we have done better had we been an independent handling a catastrophe of that magnitude? Probably not. So Democratic president, Democratic Senate, Democratic House. The first thing would be to move on statehood for those, and as you say, 4 additional senators and a number of new congressmen. You also, and this one I think would have enormous impact, but I think is highly unlikely, dividing the state of California into multiple states. There's been talk, as you know, of breaking up California off and on for years, and as someone who's lived here since '75. I follow that. I don't think it's ever going to happen. Your thoughts?
Sure. This is up the ladder of possibility a little bit. But you're right. I mean, breaking up California, the talk of that stretches back to the beginnings of California itself. In the 1850s and 1860s, there was, I think, very strong sentiment in Southern California to be separate from Northern California. There have been multiple attempts over the years to break California up. I think if you look at the predicament of California, it's the largest state in the union, and yet it does not have anywhere near the national power that it should based on its population. And that's unfortunate because, Californians have a very strong identity, sort of pride in the state. It would be logistically difficult. We need to get a ballot initiative going to break it up, and there'd be a lot of resistance to that idea. And so, that's not a month one project for Democrats, but I do think that we should start thinking about the possibility of breaking up California. It doesn't have to be 7, could be 3, could be 5, could be 9. But until we do that, there's going to be a lot of progressive energy, a lot of progressive policy sort of bottled up in the Senate because California only has 2 senators. And so it would take a while, I think, to convince Californians that this is in their interest, right? Because it would cost money. There'd be a lot of questions about, like water sharing and the university systems, and building the new infrastructure for these states. So it's the recommendation in the book is really to get people thinking about the Democrats' structural deficit in the Senate and how it's really produced by having a small number of very large states that are Democratic leaning not have the same kind of representation that these small rural states do.
Okay, so we've talked about A, what we think is the lowest hanging fruit, B, something that would have large impact, but at least we can maybe begin the ball rolling on thinking. And I think, as you say, if there were the North, the South, and the Central Valley, the Central Valley would end up probably being a Republican state, but it would still be a gain of some. And again, we're not talking about just rigging the system for Democrats. We're talking about actually representing the people, and the 2 million people who voted against Trump. I mean, the 2 million margin of Clinton over Trump in the state of California. What would be the next this good combination of likelihood to be achieved and impact?
Sure. I mean, I think another easy fix here is to look at the voting system in the U.S. We've seen over the last 20 years Republicans engage in all sorts of mischief, most prominently with these voter ID laws, these cookie-cutter voter ID laws that started getting passed during the Bush administration, and that have spread to pretty much every state where Republicans have attained unified control in the state legislature and the governorship. All the scholars that have looked at this think that it drives turnout down in marginalized communities, people who move around a lot, who can't afford to get an ID, who lose their ID. And there's people that look at Wisconsin in 2016 and believe that the voter ID law there flipped the state for Trump. There are 800,000 people in Texas that lack the necessary documentation to vote. And that's on top of a lot of other things that we do for voting in this country that are just bananas in comparative perspective. One of them is disenfranchising people who are convicted of a felony. So in many states, you can never vote again. In some states, there's an onerous process to get the franchise back. There are 1.6 million people in Florida alone who are disenfranchised based on a felony conviction.
Right, a state that I remind people went to Gore before the recount for only 537 votes.
Right, and if we didn't have these laws, Gore would have won the state going away.
Yeah,
there's no question about that,
yep.
And we would never have had George W. Bush. And so there's an easy fix for this. There's a lot of great inspirational work being done at the state level to do things like create automatic voter registration laws. Like, we're one of the few countries in the world where you have to opt in to vote rather than to opt out. We're one of the few countries in the world that doesn't set aside a holiday for voting or have voting on the weekend. And all of these things are amenable to a national fix. The Elections Clause of the Constitution very clearly gives Congress the right to regulate state procedures for federal elections. And so a month one project for the next Democratic majority in D.C. could be wiping away voter ID laws from the face of the earth, creating automatic voter registration policies that states have to comply with. We could re-enfranchise every convicted felon in the country with a simple law passed by Congress. We could create a national holiday for voting. And cumulatively, I think that those things would have a huge impact on not just the sort of character of our democracy, it's a moral imperative to me, but it would also, I think, make Democrats much more competitive in 2022. Remember, we're in a fantasy land here where Democrats have achieved unified control in D.C. in 2020. But, they have to go back and face the voters again 2 years later. The House of Representatives has the shortest election calendar in the entire democratic world. They're the only country that elects a national legislature every 2 years. It's nuts, but we can't do anything about that either because that's in the Constitution.
Okay.
And so as soon as we win power, we have to start thinking about defending that power. And one of the best ways to defend that power is to increase the number of Democratic voters by passing these laws that are they're crying out to address some of these injustices. You see the effects of that in a place like Virginia, where Governor McAuliffe re-enfranchised over 170,000 former felons prior to the 2017 election. And then, lo and behold, wouldn't you know, Democrats blew out their polling projections by like 5 points.
There you go. Yeah,
and that could happen all over the country.
Right, and then the simplest one, of course, as you point out, is to just reverse the voter suppression laws, the voter ID and other things which have been instituted, many of them only in the last few years, and just to reverse those very quickly. You say that the Democrats should pack the courts at every level. I want you to talk about that, but hasn't the Trump administration, it seems to me, one of their few achievements besides that, and I put achievements in quotes, achievements on their side, besides the tax bill, is the confirming of young right-wing judges who will rule for decades to come. Has the horse already left the barn on that one? How do and the Supreme Court seems, everything we read says, when one of the older ones, whether it's Stevens or Breyer, that everyone sort of just says, when the next one dies or retires, it'll depend on who's in. How do you look at the courts?
There's two ways of looking at the courts as a problem in American democracy. One is that lifetime tenure for the federal judiciary was one of those catastrophic mistakes made at the Constitutional Convention, whose effects I think were very poorly understood at the time because most people didn't live past 50 in 1787. They couldn't have foreseen that getting appointed to the court when you're 45 means you might spend 40 years making law. And that lifetime tenure provision and the fact that the Supreme Court is basically a lottery in terms of whether the president gets to fill those seats. Jimmy Carter got 0 picks to the Supreme Court in his 4 years in office. FDR got 0 picks in his first 4 years in office. That was part of the genesis of his court packing plan. And here's another place where the shape of the courts, not just the Supreme Court, but the district courts, the appellate courts, none of these things are spelled out in the Constitution. In fact, the very powers of the court itself are not spelled out in the Constitution. And in particular, the number 9 on the Supreme Court, not in the Constitution.
Ah.
Yeah. So, and if you look at this in sort of long-term perspective, Democrats have won the popular vote for the presidency in 6 of the last 7 elections. And it's only the Electoral College that has prevented us from having a long period of Democratic ascendancy in the executive branch. If you go back to 1992 and you tabulate all the votes for the U.S. Senate since 1992, Democrats have won 30 million more votes. And so, to me, that says, the American people have spoken very clearly that they want Democrats staffing the federal judiciary. And it's these sort of arcane, antiquated procedures that have prevented them from doing that. And even that probably wouldn't have been enough for me to recommend court packing. It was what happened with Merrick Garland that was really the last straw for my understanding of how the courts should work. And that is when Republicans used their procedural power to block President Obama from filling the seat of the late Antonin Scalia and to hold it open to the next president. To me, there is no functional difference between stealing the swing seat on the Supreme Court by using this procedural hardball and adding justices to the court in a way that is equally constitutional to holding that seat open. Right? The constitutionality here is even. Right? Both of these things are legal according to the constitutional order.
That's right. They violate norms, but they don't violate the Constitution.
Right. And so, norms are only as good as the people that are upholding them.
That's right.
And what Republicans have done over the last 20 years is really escalate this normative warfare where they refuse to abide by longstanding understandings of how the courts should be staffed and appointed. So it wasn't just Garland. It was over the last 2 years of the Obama administration. They hardly approved any justices at all.
That's right.
To the district and appellate courts. And that wasn't like a Republican invention. That's been going on for a long time. But again, it's like they escalated it, right? They only allowed Obama to fill 20 seats on the federal judiciary in his last 2 years in office. And so when Trump came in, there's just hundreds of vacancies to be filled. Pretty soon, he will have appointed 1 out of every 8 justices on the appellate courts, which is just crazy.
And the Republican strategy, based on the Federalist Society and grooming them, from college, from law school on, is to appoint young ones who will serve for a long, long time. So when you say lottery, basically it's when the president and both houses of Congress reside with the same party that the courts can be legally packed. And when that doesn't happen, and it turns out that, there's some folks that say that the people basically like it when there's split power between the president and Congress. But it's when one party has both, they can run roughshod over the courts. What about the Senate? What would you do with the Senate?
Well, again, the Senate is very difficult to change because there's a particular clause in the Constitution that says the states can't be deprived of their equal representation without their consent. And so it's not amenable to an amendment. It really isn't. So we're stuck with it, and that's why I think that we need to get started thinking about new states. There's D.C. and Puerto Rico. There's the possibility of dividing California. There's also other territories out there, like the U.S. Virgin Islands, like American Samoa. There's no threshold for how big you have to be a state. I think the Virgin Islands would probably vote in favor of statehood if they had a referendum. And so there's some of these outlying territories I think we could bring into the union, and then because they're populated largely by minorities, I think that they would almost certainly lean Democratic, if not be overwhelmingly Democratic. So, unfortunately, the plan for the Senate is more states. You got to have more states if you want to hold the Senate for more than 2 or 4 years at a time.
You also want to do away with the filibuster.
Oh yeah, of course, right. So this is another norm, really. The filibuster is just a Senate rule, and it's a Senate rule that says you need 60 votes to do just about anything, unless you're using the reconciliation process. And so here again, the book is full of things that I think are not just the right thing to do, but are imperative if Democrats actually want to make policy change the next time they're in office. So let's again go back to our fantasy world, where Democrats have swept into power in 2020. Let's say they have 55 seats in the Senate. Okay, if they abide by the filibuster rule, they will get almost nothing done. They can pack something into the the first reconciliation bill, and then after that, the Republicans are not going to cooperate with them. For us to get to 55 seats probably means the elimination of these so-called moderates like Jeff Flake or John McCain or Dean Heller. Like those people, under this scenario, those people will be gone. And the Republican caucus will be led by people like Mike Lee and Ted Cruz and Tom Cotton, none of whom I assume in January 2021 are going to be in the mood for compromise. So if we don't eliminate the filibuster, we're going to make the same mistake that Republicans are making right now, which is they're not doing much of anything with their power. And we will, Democrats will be punished for that at the next election. So those 55 seats in 2021 are going to turn right back into 45 seats in 2023, and we won't even have any policy to show for it. So, to my mind, eliminating the filibuster is another sort of like month one thing that we have to do the next time we're in power, not just because it will allow Democrats to make policy, but also because it doesn't make any sense in comparative perspective. There is no other national legislature in the world that requires supermajorities to pass routine legislation. It doesn't make any sense according to Democratic theory, right? And it causes a lot of frustration with voters because it's like we send the majority to D.C. and we're like, okay, I sent you there to do X, Y, and Z, and you can't do any of it.
That's right. So
because you can't get 60 votes.
In some sense, because of the filibuster, no matter which party is in power, the public sees not enough happening, and the cynicism and disregard for government grows.
Exactly. I mean, there's a reason that the public disapproves of the performance of Congress by like an 8-1 margin, and has done so for like 20 years now. And that's because they don't see Congress really seriously working on urgent national problems the way that they should be. And I think they're right to feel cynical about that. It's crazy. Like you should be able to make policy with 51 votes in the Senate. You really should. That's what democracy is. Right? Like we don't want majorities to run roughshod over minorities, but we also don't want minorities to be able to permanently hold up any kind of legislative progress from being made.
That's right. It is
There's an argument to be made that Republicans should be able to do more now.
Yeah.
It's like they have all three branches of government. Do it. Do what you're going to do. And then the voters would see, I think, finally, some of the consequences of Republican rule. But it would also set up Democrats to be able to make real change the next time they're in power.
Okay. Let me give you 1 minute to say what has been the response so far, and what should listeners pay attention to and do?
I've been heartened by the response to the book. A lot of people have said things like, I didn't know that a lot of these things weren't in the Constitution. I didn't know that there were things that we could do about these electoral problems, these electoral system design flaws. And then the next question is inevitably like, man, what can we do about it? Do you think anybody's listening? Are Chuck and Nancy reading the book? That kind of thing. So I think if we want, first of all, the only way to get real change, anything in the book, anything in the policy world, is we have to elect Democrats over the next 2 cycles. These are critically important elections, not just for progressive policy change, but I think for the future of our democracy, which is in real jeopardy right now, based on what's happening inside the Trump administration. But if we want the people that we elect over the next 4 years to actually pursue any of the ideas in this book, we have to organize around it. We have to call our representatives. We have to make people aware of some of these possibilities. And for pretty much every idea in the book, there's an organization that's already working on that idea. There are robust statehood movements in D.C. and Puerto Rico that you can support with your money and your time and your opinion. There's the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU that works on some of these voting issues. There's an organization called Fair Vote that works on issues related to how we elect the House of Representatives. So the trick really is to get involved with some of these groups, to tell your friends and other voters to ask about these things when you're corresponding with your members of Congress. But most important, we just have to win. And once we win, we have to make our leaders take some of these ideas seriously. So the next time Democrats are in power and they don't eliminate the filibuster, we got to get loud.
Yeah,
exactly. We got
exactly.
to do some of the things we did last summer around the healthcare fight. We have to go after our allies, hold them accountable, make it clear that we won't vote for them again if they don't get serious about change.
Very good. So the book is It's Time to Fight Dirty, How Democrats Can Build a Lasting Majority in American Politics. The website to see David's ongoing work is blogs.roosevelt.edu/dfaris. For this conversation and many other interviews, articles, transcripts, to join me in pursuit of a world that just might work, go to TerenceMcNally.net, TerenceMcNally.net, or aworldthatjustmightwork.com. That's all one word, a world that just might work. They're the same website. And if you want to receive my weekly email announcement of upcoming guests and issues, and usually 7 or 8 relevant articles, sign up at my site or email me at temcnally@mac.com, temcnally@mac.com. You can subscribe and listen to the Freeform podcast on iTunes, Podomatic, Google Play. You can find years of podcasts at my site or at those sites. Listen anytime, anywhere. Jeremy Scahill, Robert Reich, Van Jones, Connie Rice, Michael Lewis, Greg Boyle, etc. You can also follow me on Twitter at McNally Terrence. Thanks to George Vasilopoulos at Progressive Voices. And most of all to you, my listeners, please share this podcast widely. And finally, thank you, David Faris. Keep up the good work.